I never thought I'd become one of those mothers-in-law who spies on their son's wife. That's not who I am. At least, that's not who I was before everything happened. My name is Margaret, and I'm 63 years old. I've lived in the same house by Cedar Lake for 37 years, raised 2 boys here, buried my husband here 5 years ago, and thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September. I've always been an early riser, something my late husband used to tease me about. 5 in the morning, like clockwork, I'd be up making coffee and watching the mist roll across the lake. It's peaceful, you know? That time before the world wakes up, when it's just you and the silence and the birds starting their morning songs. That particular morning, I was standing at my kitchen window with my coffee mug, watching a heron pick its way through the shallows, when I saw her. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law. She was walking down the path toward the lake carrying something heavy. A suitcase, one of those old-fashioned hard-shell ones. I remember thinking it was odd because she and my son Daniel lived just 2 houses down the road, and why would she be hauling luggage at 5 in the morning? I watched as she got to the end of our shared dock. The mist was thick that morning, and I could barely make out her figure through my window. She looked around, and I instinctively stepped back, even though I knew she couldn't see me. There was something furtive about her movements, something guilty. Then she lifted that suitcase and threw it into the water, just like that. No hesitation. It hit with a splash that seemed too loud in the morning quiet, and she stood there for a moment, staring at where it had gone under. Then she turned and walked back up the path, moving faster now, almost running. I stood frozen with my coffee mug halfway to my lips. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. All sorts of thoughts were racing through my mind, and none of them were good. You hear stories, don't you? About people disposing of things they shouldn't, about secrets hidden in lakes and rivers. I tried to talk myself down. Maybe it was just old clothes. Maybe she was cleaning out their basement and thought drowning the stuff was easier than taking it to Goodwill. But even as I told myself these things, I didn't believe them. Nobody throws away a perfectly good suitcase full of clothes at dawn unless they're hiding something. I couldn't stop thinking about it all day. I went through the motions of my normal routine, tending to my garden, doing the crossword puzzle, calling my sister in Boston, but my mind kept drifting back to that image of Vanessa hurling that suitcase into the water. By 3 in the afternoon, I'd made up my mind. I had to know what was in it. The problem was, I'm 63 years old with arthritis in both knees, and a fear of deep water that goes back to a childhood incident at summer camp. I can swim, but I don't like to, and the idea of diving down to retrieve something from the lake bottom made my stomach churn. But I couldn't just let it go. What if it was something dangerous? What if someone was in trouble? That evening, Daniel stopped by for dinner like he does most Wednesdays. He's a good son, always was. Tall like his father, with the same easy smile that made me fall in love 38 years ago. He works in IT for a consulting firm downtown. Boring work, but it pays well. Vanessa works as a dental hygienist, or at least she did. She'd quit her job about 6 months ago. Said she needed a break. Daniel said she'd been stressed, not sleeping well. Daniel said, "Mom, you seem distracted tonight. Everything okay?" I looked at my son across the dinner table and almost told him. Almost said, "Your wife threw a suitcase in the lake this morning and I need to know why." But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he looked so tired, with dark circles under his eyes. Maybe it was because I wasn't sure what I'd seen actually meant anything. I said, "Just missing your father. You know how it is." He reached across and squeezed my hand. Daniel said, "I know. Some days are harder than others." After he left, I sat on my back porch and watched the last light fade from the sky. The lake was calm, smooth as glass, and somewhere out there at the end of the dock, that suitcase was sitting on the bottom. I made a decision. Tomorrow morning, I'd figure out a way to get it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vanessa's silhouette against the dawn light, the suitcase arcing through the air. At 4:30, I gave up trying and got out of bed. I made coffee and tried to formulate a plan. The truth is, I'd never been the kind of person who took risks. My whole life, I'd been careful, cautious, the type who always followed the rules and stayed within safe boundaries. My husband used to joke that I was the only person he knew who actually read instruction manuals cover to cover before using a new appliance. He'd loved that about me, he said. My predictability, my steadiness. But steady doesn't get you very far when something's wrong and nobody else sees it. Steady doesn't help when your gut is screaming that something terrible is happening, and you're the only one who can stop it. I thought about my husband that night, about what he would have done. He'd been a firefighter for 30 years before he retired, the kind of man who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. He'd always told me that the worst thing you can do in an emergency is freeze, is let fear make your decisions for you. Act first, he'd say. Think later if you have to, but act first. I'd spent 5 years missing him, 5 years trying to figure out how to be Margaret without being half of Margaret and Robert, and here I was, faced with something that required me to be brave in a way I'd never had to be before. Not physically brave, maybe, but brave enough to trust my instincts even when they seemed crazy. Robert and I had met when I was 24, at a community fundraiser for the fire department. He'd been giving tours of the fire station to kids, and I'd been volunteering at the bake sale table. I'd watched him with those children, so patient and kind, explaining how the equipment worked, letting them try on helmets that were way too big for their small heads. Something about the way he moved, the easy confidence mixed with genuine warmth, had caught my attention. He'd bought 3 pieces of pie from my table that day, said he couldn't decide which looked best, so he'd try them all. We'd laughed about it later, on our first date, when he'd admitted he'd really just been looking for an excuse to talk to me. We were married 18 months later, and I'd never regretted a single day of our 33 years together. When he died, it was sudden. A heart attack at 63, sitting in his favorite chair reading the newspaper. The doctor said he probably didn't even know what was happening, said it was quick and painless. But for me, it was anything but painless. Losing him felt like losing half of myself, like suddenly trying to navigate the world with one eye closed and one arm tied behind my back. I'd thought that was the hardest thing I'd ever have to face. The grief, the loneliness, the endless days of figuring out how to be alone after 3 decades of partnership. But now, standing in my kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, contemplating pulling a suitcase from the bottom of a lake because I thought my daughter-in-law might be a murderer, I realized there were harder things. There were things that required a different kind of strength, a different kind of courage. Robert would have understood. He'd always understood when I had those gut feelings about things, those maternal instincts that told me something was wrong even when I couldn't explain why. He'd trusted my judgment, even when it seemed irrational, especially when it seemed irrational. I remembered the time Daniel was 7 and came home from school saying he felt fine, but something in my gut told me he wasn't. Robert had wanted to let him go play with his friends, said I was worrying too much, but I'd insisted on taking his temperature, on checking him over. Turned out he had appendicitis, and if we'd waited even a few more hours, it could have burst. Robert had never questioned my instincts after that. So here I was, years later, trusting those same instincts. Trusting that what I'd seen at dawn meant something important. Trusting that I needed to know what was in that suitcase, even if it meant doing something as ridiculous as fashioning a homemade grappling hook and fishing in a lake at sunrise. I could call the police, and tell them what? That I saw someone throw luggage in a lake? They'd probably laugh at me. I could confront Vanessa directly, but what if I was wrong? What if there was a perfectly innocent explanation and I ruined my relationship with my son and his wife over nothing? No, I had to get that suitcase myself. I remembered that old fishing pole in my garage, the one my husband used to use. And I had rope, lots of rope from various projects over the years. Maybe I could fashion some kind of grappling hook, drag the bottom until I snagged it. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. I spent 20 minutes in my garage, digging through boxes and shelves, trying to find the right equipment. The garage was a mess, filled with the accumulated debris of 37 years of living in one place. Robert's old tools still hung on the pegboard he'd installed when we first moved in. His workbench was covered with half-finished projects he'd never gotten around to completing. I'd been meaning to clean it out for 5 years now, but I could never bring myself to do it. Getting rid of his things felt like erasing him completely. The fishing pole was in the back corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. I remembered the last time Robert had used it, maybe 2 years before he died. We'd sat out on the dock together on a warm summer evening, not really caring if we caught anything, just enjoying being together in the quiet. That dock had seen so much of our life. First kisses under the stars when we were dating, teaching the boys to fish when they were small, watching fireworks on the 4th of July, reading books on lazy Sunday afternoons, dancing in the moonlight on our anniversary. It was where Robert had proposed, down on one knee at the edge of the water, the ring box shaking in his nervous hands. And now it was where I'd seen something that might destroy my family. I found 3 large metal hooks that had once been part of some kind of pulley system, heavy and sharp. I tied them together with fishing line, creating a crude grappling device. My fingers fumbled with the knots, partly from the early morning chill, partly from fear. Then I attached it to the end of the pole, adding weights to help it sink. It looked ridiculous, like something a child would make, but it might work. It had to work. The sky was just starting to lighten when I made my way down to the dock. The air was cool and damp, carrying that particular scent of morning by the water, a mix of algae and fish and earth. The lake was perfectly still, like a mirror reflecting the pale sky. It would have been beautiful if I hadn't been so terrified. I could hear birds starting to wake up in the trees around the lake, their songs breaking the silence. A fish jumped somewhere out in the middle of the water, the splash echoing across the stillness. At 6 a.m, I was down at the dock with my makeshift fishing rig. I felt ridiculous, like a crazy old woman standing there in my gardening clothes and rubber boots with my husband's old fishing pole and a contraption that looked like it belonged in a cartoon. But I cast the line out anyway, watching the hooks sink into the dark water with a soft plop. For 2 hours, I dragged the bottom of that lake. My arms ached, my back screamed in protest, and I was beginning to think the whole thing was hopeless. The suitcase could be anywhere. The lake wasn't huge, maybe half a mile across at its widest point, but it was deep enough in places that I couldn't see the bottom even on the clearest days, and currents could have moved the suitcase. I tried to remember exactly where I'd seen Vanessa standing when she threw it, tried to calculate angles and distances, but everything had been obscured by mist that morning. The physical pain was nothing compared to the mental anguish. With each failed cast, my mind conjured worse and worse scenarios. What if the suitcase contained evidence of multiple murders? What if Vanessa had been doing this for years, to other people? What if Daniel wasn't her first victim? What if I was too late to save him? The thoughts spiraled, getting darker and more terrifying with each passing minute. I thought about giving up more than once. My shoulders were burning, and I could feel blisters forming on my palms despite the gardening gloves I'd put on. I was 63 years old, not exactly in my prime, and this kind of physical labor wasn't something I did regularly. My arthritis was flaring up, making my knees ache with every shift of my weight. Sweat was running down my back despite the cool morning air. My hands were cramping. My neck felt like it was made of concrete, but every time I considered quitting, I thought about Daniel, my boy, my firstborn. What if he was in danger and I gave up because my arms hurt? The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning mist. I could see clear across the lake to the houses on the other side. I wondered if anyone was watching me, this crazy old woman fishing at dawn with homemade equipment. What would they think if they knew what I was really doing? The dock creaked beneath my feet as I shifted my weight, casting the line out one more time. This would be my last attempt, I decided. If I didn't find it this time, I'd have to think of another plan. Maybe I could hire a diver, tell them I'd lost something valuable in the lake. Maybe I could rent one of those underwater cameras like they use for search and rescue operations. Maybe I could... Then, on what I'd decided would be my last cast, I felt something heavy snag the line. My heart jumped into my throat. For a moment, I just stood there, not quite believing it. Was it really the suitcase? Or just a log? A rock? Some piece of old junk that had been sitting at the bottom of the lake for decades? An old tire or a rusted shopping cart or one of the 1,000 other things people thoughtlessly dump in bodies of water? Then I started reeling it in, slowly, carefully, terrified I'd lose it. The pole bent almost double from the weight. Whatever I'd caught was substantial. This had to be it. It took me nearly 15 minutes to get it close to shore. By then, my hands were shaking and I was covered in sweat despite the cool morning air. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The muscles in my arms were screaming, threatening to give out. I had to stop several times, had to rest the pole against the dock railing while I caught my breath and flexed my cramping fingers. My whole body was trembling from the exertion and the adrenaline. Finally, I could see it through the water, a dark shape rising from the depths. The suitcase. It was real. I'd actually found it. Part of me had been hoping I wouldn't, hoping that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe I was just a paranoid old woman seeing threats where none existed. But no. There it was, solid and heavy and full of secrets, brown leather with metal corners, water streaming from its seams. I managed to haul it onto the dock and just sat there for a moment, staring at it. Water poured from its seams, creating a dark puddle around my feet. It was locked with a small combination lock, rusted but still functional. The suitcase itself was old, the kind with hard sides and leather corners, probably from the 70s or 80s. Not the kind of thing anyone threw away unless they were disposing of something they never wanted found. Now that I had it, I wasn't sure I wanted to open it. What if there was something horrible inside? What if my worst fears were confirmed? What if opening this suitcase changed everything? What if I was about to discover that my sweet daughter-in-law, the woman I'd welcomed into my family with open arms, was a monster. What if there was something in here that I could never unsee, never unknow? But I'd come this far. There was no turning back now. There was. I took the suitcase back to my house and set it on newspapers spread across my kitchen floor. I found a screwdriver and a hammer and went to work on the lock. It took some doing, but eventually the lock broke free. I took a deep breath and opened the lid. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Papers. Stacks and stacks of papers, all in plastic bags that had mostly kept the water out. Bank statements, legal documents, medical records, and photographs. Dozens of photographs. I started pulling things out, laying them across my kitchen table. As I read, the pieces started falling into place, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. The bank statements showed accounts I'd never heard of in my son's name, but the signatures didn't look like his handwriting. Transfers of money, large amounts, going in and out. The legal documents were insurance policies, life insurance policies on Daniel, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Recent policies that I knew he'd never mentioned. I sat down heavily in one of my kitchen chairs, my legs suddenly unable to support me. 3 different policies, each one worth over $200,000. All purchased within the last year, all with Vanessa listed as the beneficiary. I thought about Daniel mentioning that Vanessa had been handling their finances lately, said she wanted to take some of the burden off him since he was working such long hours. At the time, I'd thought it was sweet, considerate. Now it looked like something else entirely. But it was the photographs that really scared me. Pictures of Daniel, candid shots taken from a distance, him leaving work, him at the grocery store, him jogging in the park. Date stamps showed they'd been taken over the past 6 months. Someone had been following my son. I spread the photos across the table, arranging them in chronological order. There were dozens of them, maybe 50 or 60 in total. Some were taken with a telephoto lens from far away. Others were closer, taken from across a street or from a parked car. In every single one, Daniel was alone. No Vanessa, no friends. Just my son, going about his daily life, completely unaware that someone was documenting his every move. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I looked at them. This wasn't just someone keeping tabs on a spouse. This was surveillance. Professional, methodical, obsessive. The kind of thing you did when you were planning something terrible. And then I found the medical records. They were Daniel's records, but there were things in there that didn't match what I knew about his health. Prescriptions for medications he'd never mentioned. Diagnosis codes for conditions he'd never talked about. Blood work results that showed abnormalities. I picked up one of the prescription records and squinted at it. Digoxin. I'd never heard of it. I grabbed my laptop from the living room and searched for it. My stomach turned as I read the results. A heart medication, but also something that could be toxic in the wrong doses. Symptoms of toxicity included nausea, vomiting, confusion, vision problems. Daniel had been complaining about all of those things. There were other medications too, things I'd never heard him mention taking. And his blood work showed declining kidney function, elevated liver enzymes. My son was being systematically poisoned, and these documents proved it. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the last item, a small notebook with a worn leather cover. I opened it and saw Vanessa's handwriting. It was a journal of sorts, but the entries were clinical, detached, dates and times, medication names and dosages, observations about symptoms and side effects. I read through the entries, each one making me feel sicker. The journal went back 8 months. 8 months of carefully documented poisoning. She'd started small, testing doses, watching for reactions, then gradually increased the amounts as Daniel's body built up tolerance. She'd noted everything, when he complained of headaches, when he missed work due to illness, when he went to the doctor. The most recent entry, dated 3 days ago, read, "Increased dosage again. He's getting sicker but doesn't suspect anything. Should be complete within 3 weeks. Must dispose of evidence before then." I dropped the notebook like it had burned me. My daughter-in-law was poisoning my son. For a long moment, I just stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a plot to murder my child, and I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Then reality crashed over me like a wave, and I grabbed my phone. My first instinct was to call Daniel, but I stopped with my finger hovering over his name in my contacts. What would I say? What if Vanessa was there? What if telling him put him in immediate danger? No, I needed to think this through. I needed help. I called my younger son, Thomas, who lives 3 hours away in Chicago. He's a lawyer, corporate law, not criminal, but he'd know what to do. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep. Thomas said, "Mom, it's 7 in the morning. Is everything okay? I said, Thomas, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your brother is in danger. I heard him sit up, suddenly alert. Thomas said, What? What's going on? Is he hurt? I said, Not yet, but he will be if we don't do something. I need you to come up here now, and we need to call the police. Vanessa is trying to kill him. There was a pause on the other end. Thomas said, Mom, that's a serious accusation. What makes you think? I said, I have proof. Documents, records, a journal. Thomas, I'm not imagining this. I'm looking at the evidence right now. Please, you have to believe me. I heard him moving around, getting dressed. Thomas said, Okay, I'm coming. Don't do anything. Don't confront anyone. I'll call a friend who works in the DA's office. Just stay in your house and lock the doors. I'll be there as soon as I can. After I hung up, I gathered all the documents and put them back in the suitcase. Then I took photos of everything with my phone, just in case. My mind was racing. How long had this been going on? How sick was Daniel? The journal suggested she'd been poisoning him for months. I thought back over the past year, trying to remember signs I might have missed. Daniel had lost weight, but I'd attributed that to stress from work. He'd mentioned headaches, fatigue, stomach problems, but he'd said his doctor couldn't find anything wrong. Of course, the doctor couldn't find anything wrong, because he was being poisoned at home, probably in his food or drinks, something that wouldn't show up on standard tests. I thought about Vanessa, tried to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the monster who could do this. She'd been part of our family for 4 years. They'd met at a hospital fundraiser where Daniel had been setting up computer systems. She'd seemed sweet, a little shy, with a quick smile. The wedding had been small, just family and close friends, at a vineyard upstate. I'd welcomed her with open arms. Had it all been an act? Had she married my son just to kill him for insurance money? Or had something happened? Something that turned her into someone capable of murder. I was still sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the suitcase, when I heard a knock at my front door. My heart stopped. It was only 8 in the morning. Thomas couldn't be here yet. I walked slowly to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Vanessa. She was standing on my porch, and even through the distorted view of the peephole, I could see she looked agitated. She knocked again, harder this time. Vanessa called out, Margaret, are you home? I need to talk to you. My mind raced. She knew, somehow, she knew I'd found the suitcase. Maybe she'd been watching, had seen me dragging it from the lake. Maybe she had cameras set up, some way of monitoring the dock. I stood frozen, not knowing what to do. If I didn't answer, would she break in? If I did answer, was I in danger? I thought about the journal entries, about how methodically she'd been poisoning my son. Someone capable of that was capable of anything. My phone was in my pocket. I could call 911 if I needed to. But would they get here in time if Vanessa decided to do something drastic? She knocked again. Vanessa said, Margaret, please. It's important. It's about Daniel. That decided it. If this was about my son, I had to know what she wanted. But I wasn't stupid. I grabbed my phone, quickly texted Thomas that Vanessa was here. Then I opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. I said, Vanessa, what brings you by so early? She looked terrible. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair was a mess, and she was wearing the same clothes I'd seen her in yesterday. She looked like she hadn't slept. There were scratches on her hands, dirt under her fingernails. She looked like someone who'd been through hell. Vanessa said, Can I come in? I need to talk to you about something serious. I said, I'm actually in the middle of something. Can it wait? She shook her head, and I saw tears start to form in her eyes. Vanessa said, No, it can't wait. Margaret, I'm scared. I think Daniel is in danger, and I don't know what to do. My breath caught in my throat. Was this some kind of trick? Some way to find out what I knew? I studied her face through the gap in the door, trying to read her expression, trying to figure out if this was genuine fear or a performance. I said, What do you mean he's in danger? She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Vanessa said, Can I please come in? I don't want to talk about this on the porch where anyone could hear. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to let her in. But another part of me, the part that had been a mother for almost 40 years, recognized genuine terror when I saw it. And Vanessa looked terrified. Against my better judgment, I unhooked the chain and let her in. But I kept my phone in my hand, my finger poised over the emergency call button, and I positioned myself between her and the kitchen, where the suitcase sat in plain view on the floor. I led her to the living room and we sat down, me in the chair closest to the door. Her on the couch. She was crying now. Really crying, her whole body shaking with sobs. I sat there watching her, not saying anything, waiting to see what she'd do next. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to reach out and offer some kind of consolation. But another part of me, the part that had seen what was in that suitcase, kept me frozen in my chair. Vanessa said, "I don't know how to say this. I've been trying to figure out what to do for weeks now. I'm so scared, Margaret. I'm so scared." I said, "Just tell me. What's going on?" She took a shuddering breath and looked up at me with those red, swollen eyes. Vanessa said, "Someone is trying to kill Daniel. I've been trying to protect him, trying to figure out who it is, but I don't have proof and I don't know who to trust. And now I think they know that I know." I stared at her, completely blindsided. This was not what I'd expected her to say. I said, "What are you talking about? Who's trying to kill Daniel?" She shook her head. Vanessa said, "I don't know. That's the problem. But someone is poisoning him. I've been documenting everything, collecting evidence, trying to figure out who has access to our house, to his food." At first I thought I was paranoid, but then I found medication in our house that neither of us had prescribed, and Daniel's been getting sicker and sicker. My mind was reeling. Was she lying? Was this some elaborate cover story she'd prepared in case she got caught? But she seemed genuinely terrified. I said, "If you think someone's poisoning Daniel, why haven't you gone to the police?" She laughed, a bitter sound. Vanessa said, "Because I know how it looks. The wife thinks someone's poisoning her husband. They'd immediately suspect me. I'd be the first person they'd investigate, and whoever is really doing this would get away with it. So I've been investigating on my own, documenting everything, trying to build a case that proves it isn't me. I thought about the journal I'd found, the clinical entries about medications and symptoms. I said, "So you've been keeping records of his symptoms?" She nodded eagerly. Vanessa said, "Yes. Every time he gets sick, every symptom, I write it down. I've been collecting samples of his food, keeping them in our storage freezer. I've been taking pictures of anything suspicious I find. I've been following the money, looking at our accounts, trying to figure out if someone's setting me up." I said, "What do you mean setting you up?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Vanessa said, "Someone opened life insurance policies on Daniel. Big ones. In my name. But I never applied for them. Someone forged my signature. And there's money moving in and out of accounts I've never heard of, but the signatures look like mine. It's like someone is creating a paper trail that makes it look like I'm planning to kill him for the insurance money." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. This was exactly opposite of what I'd thought was happening. I said, "Vanessa, why are you telling me this now?" She stood up, wringing her hands. Vanessa said, "Because last night I found a listening device in our bedroom. Someone is monitoring us. They know that I know. And this morning when I went to check on the evidence I've been collecting, I've been hiding it in a safe place. It was gone. Someone broke into the storage unit and took everything. All my proof is gone." I said, "What storage unit?" She looked at me, confused. Vanessa said, "The one by the marina. I rented it under a fake name, thought it would be safe, but somehow they found it. They took everything. All the food samples, the fake documents, the photos, everything. It's all gone." My heart was pounding now. If she was telling the truth, if she wasn't the one trying to kill Daniel, then who was? And where did the suitcase I'd pulled from the lake fit into all of this? I made a decision. I said, "Come with me." I led her to the kitchen and showed her the suitcase sitting on my floor, still wet, the contents spread across my table. Her face went white. Vanessa said, "Where did you get that?" I said, "I saw you throw it in the lake yesterday morning. I pulled it out." She put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. Vanessa said, "That's not possible. I would never." She moved closer to the table, looking at the documents spread across it. Then she picked up one of the photographs and her hand started shaking. Vanessa said, "This isn't mine. I didn't take these pictures. Margaret, I didn't throw this suitcase in the lake. Yesterday morning, I was at work. I picked up an early shift at 6 because one of the other hygienists called in sick. I didn't even come home until after 1 in the afternoon. I said, "But I saw you. I saw you walking down to the dock at 5 in the morning." She turned to look at me, and the terror in her eyes was real. Vanessa said, "That wasn't me." We stood there staring at each other as the implications sank in. If Vanessa didn't throw the suitcase in the lake, then who did? Someone who looked like her. Someone who wanted it to look like she was disposing of evidence. Vanessa said, "Someone is framing me. They're setting me up to take the fall for Daniel's murder." I said, "We need to call the police, right now." She grabbed my arm. Vanessa said, "Wait, if we call the police now, what do we have?" "A suitcase full of documents that make it look like I'm planning to murder my husband. My word that I didn't throw it in the lake, that someone who looks like me did. They'll arrest me immediately, and whoever is really behind this will have succeeded." I said, "So what do we do?" She thought for a moment, then said, "We need to protect Daniel first. He can't eat or drink anything at home. We need to get him somewhere safe, and we need to figure out who's behind this before they make their next move." I called Thomas back and told him to call off the police for now, but to still come up. Then Vanessa and I came up with a plan. We needed to get Daniel out of his house without tipping off whoever was watching. We needed to make it look natural. I called Daniel at work. I said, "Honey, I'm not feeling well. Would you mind coming over tonight and staying with me? I hate to be alone when I'm feeling sick." Daniel said, "Of course, Mom. What's wrong?" I said, "Just a stomach bug, I think. Nothing serious, but you know how I get anxious." He promised to come over right after work. That gave us about 8 hours to figure out what to do next. Vanessa and I spent the day going through the documents from the suitcase, trying to find any clue about who might be behind this. The life insurance policies had been purchased through an online broker, payments made from an account that didn't belong to either Vanessa or Daniel. The medical records had been accessed through Daniel's patient portal, but the IP addresses showed they'd been downloaded from a location neither of them recognized. We found a pattern in the surveillance photos. They'd all been taken from specific angles, always showing Daniel alone, never showing who might be with him. Professional work, or at least someone who knew what they were doing. I made sandwiches for lunch that neither of us really ate. We just sat there, surrounded by papers and photographs, trying to make sense of it all. Vanessa had brought her laptop over, and we started cross-referencing everything we could find. Bank account numbers, IP addresses, the locations where the photos had been taken. Vanessa pulled up Daniel's credit report, something she had access to as his wife. There were inquiries on there from companies she didn't recognize. Someone had been checking his credit, probably to make sure he was worth the effort of framing her and collecting the insurance money. I said, "What about people from your past? Old boyfriends? Jealous coworkers? Anyone who might have a grudge?" Vanessa shook her head. Vanessa said, "I've thought about that. I haven't dated anyone seriously since college, and that ended amicably. I get along fine with my coworkers, or at least I did before I quit. There's no one I can think of who would want to hurt me like this." I said, "What about Daniel? Old girlfriends? Anyone who didn't take the breakup well?" Vanessa paused, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Vanessa said, "There was someone, Amanda. They dated in college for about 3 years. Daniel said she was intense, wanted to get married right after graduation. He broke it off because he wasn't ready for that kind of commitment. He said she didn't handle it well, but he thought she'd moved on. He lost touch with her after that." Something about the way she said the name made my skin prickle. I said, "Amanda? What was her last name?" Vanessa said, "Parker. Amanda Parker. Why?" I didn't answer. Instead, I started searching through the papers again, looking for anything with that name on it. And then Vanessa found something in the notebook, in the margins of one of the pages. A partial phone number, written quickly, like someone had jotted it down and forgotten about it. 7 digits with the area code cut off by the edge of the page. Vanessa said, "I've seen this number before, or something like it. Give me a second." She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through something. Then she stopped, her face going pale. She turned her phone to show me a contact entry. The number matched the partial number in the notebook, and the name attached to it made my blood run cold. It was Amanda Parker, Daniel's ex-girlfriend from college. Vanessa said, "Oh God." I said, "When did you save this number?" Vanessa said, "I didn't. This is Daniel's phone backup. I have access to it in case of emergencies. This contact has been in his phone for years, since before we met. He must have never deleted it." I said, "Do you know anything about her? Where she lives now? What she does?" Vanessa was already looking her up online. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, and within minutes, she'd found Amanda's social media profiles. The woman had never married, never seemed to have any serious relationships after Daniel. Her posts were often about fate and destiny, about how some people were meant to be together. Several of her profile pictures had been taken near Cedar Lake. Vanessa said, "She lives here. She lives in this town." How did we not know that? I remembered Amanda vaguely. I'd met her once or twice when Daniel brought her home for holidays during college. Pretty girl, very intense. I remembered she'd been possessive of Daniel, didn't like him spending time with his friends or family without her. At Christmas dinner one year, She'd barely spoken to anyone, just sat there watching Daniel with these strange, intense eyes. When they'd broken up, I'd been relieved, though I'd never told Daniel that. There was something about her that had made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't have said exactly what. I said, "Do you think she's been holding a grudge all these years?" Vanessa was scrolling through Amanda's social media history, going back years. The further back she went, the more obsessive the posts became. Pictures of places where she and Daniel had gone together in college. Posts about their anniversary dates, years after they'd broken up. References to their future together, written in present tense, as if they were still a couple. Vanessa said, "This isn't a grudge, this is obsession. Look at this." She showed me a post from 2 years ago, around the time she and Daniel had gotten engaged. It was a picture of a sunset over a lake, with a caption that read, "What's meant to be will always find a way back. Obstacles are temporary. True love is forever." There were more posts like that, cryptic references to waiting, to patience, to removing obstacles. And then I noticed something. Starting about 18 months ago, the posts became less frequent but more specific. References to Cedar Lake, photos taken around town, a picture of the coffee shop near Daniel's office, a shot of the park where he jogged. She'd been here in our town for at least 18 months. Watching, waiting, planning. Vanessa said, "If Amanda's been following Daniel, if she's been planning this, she'd have access to everything. She could have broken into our house when we were at work, planted listening devices, taken samples of our handwriting to forge documents." I said, "But why frame you? Why not just try to get back together with Daniel?" Vanessa looked at me with haunted eyes. Vanessa said, "Because I'm in the way. If I go to prison for murdering Daniel, and Daniel miraculously recovers once I'm gone, who do you think he'll turn to? Who'll be there to comfort him? She's not trying to kill him. She's trying to make him sick enough that he needs someone to take care of him, sick enough that everyone believes he was being poisoned. And when I'm arrested, she'll be there. She'll step in as the concerned ex-girlfriend who never stopped caring. She'll nurse him back to health, and he'll be grateful and vulnerable, and she'll finally have him back." It was diabolical, and it made a horrible kind of sense. We spent the rest of the afternoon digging deeper. We found more connections, small things that individually meant nothing but together painted a terrifying picture. Amanda had been working as a pharmacy technician at the hospital where Vanessa used to work. She'd have access to medications, would know what drugs could cause the symptoms Daniel had been experiencing. She'd quit her job about the time Vanessa quit hers, almost like she was following her schedule. We found social media posts from Amanda's accounts that showed her at places Daniel frequented, always just in the background of photos other people posted. The coffee shop near his office, the park where he jogged, the grocery store he used. She'd been stalking him for years, and none of us had noticed. I found a post from 3 years ago, a picture taken at a hospital fundraiser. Daniel was in the background, talking to someone, and right behind him, partially hidden by a column, was Amanda. She'd been there that night, the night Daniel had met Vanessa. She'd watched them meet. She'd watched the beginning of their relationship, and she'd been planning her revenge ever since. When Daniel arrived at 6 that evening, Vanessa and I met him at the door. The look on his face when he saw us both there, saw the seriousness in our expressions, told me he knew something was wrong. Daniel said, "Mom? Vanessa? What's going on?" We sat him down and told him everything. Showed him the documents, explained about the suitcase, told him about Amanda. He listened in stunned silence, his face growing paler with every revelation. I watched my son process the fact that someone he'd cared about years ago had been trying to destroy his life, had been poisoning him for months, and my heart broke for him. When we finished, he just sat there for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been feeling sick for months. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. They said it was probably stress, maybe a virus, but it kept getting worse." His voice cracked on that last word, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. My strong, capable son, who'd always been so confident, so sure of himself, looked broken, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. Vanessa reached for his hand. Vanessa said, "We need to get you to a hospital. A different one, not the one where Amanda worked. You need blood tests, toxicology screens. We need to document what's in your system before we go to the police." Daniel nodded, but he was still staring at the documents spread across my table, at the photographs of himself, taken without his knowledge, at the insurance policies someone had taken out on his life, at the journal entries detailing his symptoms like he was some kind of experiment. Daniel said, "She's been watching me. For how long? Years? How did I not notice? I moved to sit beside him, put my arm around his shoulders like I used to do when he was small and the world had hurt him somehow. I said, because you weren't looking for it. Because you trusted that when that relationship ended, it was really over. You're not the one who did anything wrong here. He leaned into me, and I felt him shaking. My baby, my firstborn, who'd grown into such a good man, was scared. And I couldn't blame him. How do you process the fact that someone has been orchestrating your death for months? That every meal you ate at home might have been poisoned? That your own wife had been framed to take the fall? Thomas arrived an hour later, and with his legal expertise, we formulated a plan. We'd take Daniel to a hospital in Chicago, where Thomas had connections with doctors who could run the necessary tests. We'd document everything, build an airtight case. Then we'd go to the police with evidence that couldn't be ignored or explained away. But first, we had to be careful. If Amanda had listening devices in Daniel and Vanessa's house, she might already know that we were onto her. We had to assume we were being watched. We decided to make it look like Daniel was staying with me because I was sick, just as we'd originally planned. Vanessa would go home and act normal, give Amanda no reason to suspect anything had changed. Thomas would take Daniel to Chicago in his car, parked down the street where it couldn't be easily seen from any of our houses. It was risky, but it was the best plan we had. Before Daniel left, he pulled me aside. We stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd opened that suitcase this morning, where I'd discovered the plot to destroy my family. Daniel said, "Mom, if you hadn't pulled that suitcase out of the lake, if you hadn't trusted your instincts, I'd be dead in 3 weeks. Vanessa would be in prison. And Amanda would have gotten away with it." I hugged him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the fierce sweat that clung to him now. I said, "Your father always told me that the worst thing you can do in an emergency is freeze. He said you have to act, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." I was terrified this morning, pulling that suitcase up. I almost didn't do it, but I kept thinking about you, about what might happen if I didn't. He pulled back to look at me, and I saw so much in his eyes. Fear, yes, but also love, gratitude. The same look he used to give me when I'd fixed some childhood problem that had seemed insurmountable to him. Daniel said, "Thank you for not freezing, for being brave enough to see this through." Everything went smoothly at first. Thomas and Daniel left around 9, using the back door and cutting through the woods to where Thomas had parked. Vanessa stayed with me for another hour, then headed home, making sure to be visible, to wave at neighbors, to act like everything was normal. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow outside my window looked like someone watching. I kept thinking about Amanda, about how she'd been orchestrating all of this for years without any of us knowing, how patient she'd been, how calculated. I thought about all the times Daniel had mentioned feeling sick over the past months, the headaches that wouldn't go away, the nausea that kept him home from work, the fatigue that made him cancel plans. I'd attributed it to stress from his job, to the normal wear and tear of adult life. Never once had I suspected he was being poisoned. Never once had I thought to question whether something more sinister might be happening. What kind of mother misses something like that? What kind of mother doesn't see that her child is in mortal danger? But then I thought about Vanessa, who had seen it, who'd been trying to protect Daniel, trying to figure out who was behind it, trying to build a case while simultaneously being framed for the very crime she was trying to prevent. How terrified she must have been, knowing someone was poisoning her husband but not knowing who or why or how to prove it. Around 2 a.m, my phone rang. It was Thomas. Thomas said, "Mom, we're at the hospital. They're running tests now, but the doctor said Daniel's symptoms are consistent with chronic exposure to antifreeze, ethylene glycol poisoning. In small doses over time, it causes exactly what Daniel's been experiencing: headaches, fatigue, nausea, organ damage. If it had gone on much longer, he'd have gone into kidney failure." I felt sick to my stomach. Antifreeze. Such a simple thing, something you could buy at any auto parts store. Sweet tasting, easy to hide in food or drinks, and absolutely deadly in the right doses over time. I said, "How long before we have proof?" Thomas said, "The tox screen results should be back in a few hours. Once we have them, I'm calling the police. We've got enough now. The documents you found, Vanessa's testimony, Daniel's medical evidence, they'll have to investigate." I said, "Is he going to be okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Thomas said, "The doctor said he's lucky. Another week or 2 at the doses he was receiving and the damage might have been permanent. As it is, he'll need treatment, close monitoring for a while. But yeah, Mom, he's going to be okay." I started crying then, the relief and fear and exhaustion of the past 24 hours finally overwhelming me. My son was going to be okay. We'd found out in time. We'd stopped it before it was too late. Thomas said, "Mom, you saved his life. You know that, right? If you hadn't seen what you saw, if you hadn't pulled that suitcase out of the lake, we'd be planning his funeral right now." After I hung up, I just sat in my dark living room, staring at nothing. My son had been slowly dying, and none of us had realized it. We'd all thought he was just stressed, just sick with something the doctors couldn't identify. But all along, someone who claimed to love him had been poisoning him, day after day, week after week. After I hung up, I just sat in my dark living room, staring at nothing. My son had been slowly dying, and none of us had realized it. We'd all thought he was just stressed, just sick with something the doctors couldn't identify. But all along, someone who claimed to love him had been poisoning him, day after day, week after week. I must have dozed off in my chair, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my windows and my phone was ringing again. It was Vanessa, and she sounded panicked. Vanessa said, "Margaret, someone broke into our house last night, while I was sleeping. I just woke up and found the door to our bedroom open. Nothing's missing, but someone was in here." I said, "Get out of there. Right now. Come to my house." She said, "I'm already in my car. I'll be there in 2 minutes." When she arrived, she was shaking. We locked all my doors and windows, and I called Thomas to tell him what had happened. He said the police were already on their way to Cedar Lake. The talk screens had come back positive. They had enough for an arrest warrant. The next few hours were a blur. Police cars arrived at my house, at Daniel and Vanessa's house, at Amanda's apartment across town. Officers came to take our statements, to collect the suitcase and its contents as evidence. A detective sat with us and listened as Vanessa and I explained everything we'd discovered, showed them the photos and documents we'd copied. Detective Harris was his name, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd first opened that suitcase, and he listened to our story without interrupting. When we finished, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. Detective Harris said, "In 28 years on the force, I've seen a lot of things. But this level of planning, this patience, it's something else entirely." He pulled out his notebook and started asking questions. When had Daniel first started feeling sick? When had Vanessa first noticed something was wrong? How long had we known about Amanda? When had I pulled the suitcase from the lake? I answered everything as thoroughly as I could, but my mind kept drifting to Amanda's apartment, where other officers were right now going through her things, collecting evidence. What would they find? More proof of her obsession? More evidence of her plans? Vanessa said, "Detective, do you think she'll try to run?" Detective Harris shook his head. Detective Harris said, "We have officers watching her place. She hasn't left her apartment since last night. From what we can tell, she has no idea we're coming." He was wrong about that. When they arrived at Amanda's apartment to execute the arrest warrant, they found her in the middle of packing to leave town. Suitcases open on the bed, clothes scattered everywhere, car keys in her hand. According to the detective who interviewed us later, she'd looked genuinely shocked when they knocked on her door, like she couldn't believe her perfect plan had fallen apart. In her apartment, they found more surveillance equipment, notebooks full of plans, and a collection of photographs of Daniel that covered an entire wall. They found the medication she'd been using, purchased under fake prescriptions using credentials she'd stolen from the hospital where she'd worked. They found emails she'd written but never sent, rambling letters about destiny and second chances and how Vanessa had stolen what was rightfully hers. They found a calendar with dates circled in red. The date 3 weeks from now, the date mentioned in the journal entry, was marked with a single word: free. That was when she'd expected Daniel to die, when she'd expected Vanessa to be arrested, when she'd expected to finally have Daniel back. The detective showed us some of the things they'd found, asked us to verify certain details. There was a photo album, different from the surveillance photos. These were pictures of Daniel and Amanda from college, smiling and happy, arms around each other. Normal couple photos. But Amanda had continued the album past their breakup, adding newer photos of Daniel, photos she'd taken secretly. She'd inserted herself into his life through these pictures, creating a false narrative where they'd never broken apart. There was also a wedding dress hanging in her closet, white lace, vintage style, in Vanessa's size. A receipt showed it had been purchased 6 months ago. She'd been planning to wear it, planning to step into Vanessa's life completely once Vanessa was out of the way. Amanda had been planning this for nearly 5 years. She'd moved to Cedar Lake shortly after Daniel and Vanessa got engaged, had gotten a job at the hospital specifically to have access to drugs and medical records. She'd been patient, methodical, waiting for the right time to make her move. The listening devices in their house had been placed 2 years ago. She'd been monitoring their lives, learning their routines, waiting for opportunities. When Vanessa quit her job and started showing signs of stress, Amanda had seen her chance. She'd started poisoning Daniel, slowly, carefully, while simultaneously building a case that would frame Vanessa. The storage unit Vanessa had rented? Amanda had been following her when she'd gone there, had broken into it and taken the evidence Vanessa had been collecting. She'd used that same evidence to create the suitcase she'd thrown in the lake, the one meant to look like Vanessa was disposing of proof of her guilt. It was only because I'd happened to be looking out my window at the right moment, only because I'd been suspicious enough to pull that suitcase from the lake, that the whole plan had unraveled. The trial was 8 months later. Amanda pleaded not guilty, claimed she'd been trying to help Daniel, that Vanessa was the real poisoner, and Amanda had just been collecting evidence. But the prosecution had too much proof. The surveillance photos, the forged documents, the emails, the medications found in her apartment, Vanessa's alibi for the morning I'd seen the suitcase thrown in the lake, backed up by time cards from her workplace. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I sat through every day of it, listening to testimony, watching evidence being presented, seeing the woman who'd tried to destroy my family sitting there at the defense table looking serene and unrepentant. She dressed conservatively, wore minimal makeup, played the part of the concerned ex-girlfriend who'd only wanted to help. But I could see through it now. I could see the obsession in her eyes, the cold calculation behind every tear she shed. The prosecution presented our case methodically. They showed the jury the surveillance photographs, hundreds of them, documenting years of stalking. They showed the listening devices that had been planted in Daniel and Vanessa's home, the ones the police had found hidden in light fixtures and electrical outlets. They presented testimony from Daniel's doctors about the antifreeze poisoning, about how close he'd come to dying. They showed the life insurance policies, the forged signatures, the fake bank accounts. They presented the journal I'd found in the suitcase with its clinical entries about medications and symptoms. A handwriting expert testified that the journal was definitely in Amanda's handwriting, despite her claims that it had been planted by Vanessa. The most damning evidence, though, was what the police had found in Amanda's apartment. Not just the medications and the surveillance equipment, but the shrine. That's what the detective called it. An entire wall covered with photographs of Daniel, some going back to their college days, news clippings about his promotions at work, copies of his social media posts, a wedding invitation, Vanessa's face scratched out, replaced with a photo of Amanda in a white dress, and the letters. Oh God, the letters. Dozens of them, written but never sent, rambling pages about destiny and fate, and how Vanessa had stolen what was rightfully Amanda's, how Daniel would understand someday that they were meant to be together, how removing obstacles was just part of God's plan for them. The defense tried to paint Amanda as mentally ill, not responsible for her actions. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about obsessive disorders and delusional thinking, but the prosecution countered with evidence of how calculated everything had been. How she'd planned for years, gotten a job at the hospital specifically to have access to medications, rented the storage unit under a fake name, purchased the suitcase from a thrift store with cash so there'd be no paper trail. This wasn't delusion. This was cold, calculated planning. Daniel had to testify. I watched my son take the stand, watched him recount the months of illness, the fear he'd felt when he realized someone had been poisoning him. He looked at Amanda while he spoke, and I saw him searching her face for some sign of remorse, some indication that the girl he'd dated in college was still in there somewhere. But Amanda just stared back at him with this strange, serene expression, like she was watching a movie about someone else's life, like none of this was really happening. Vanessa testified too. She talked about the stress of trying to protect Daniel while simultaneously being framed for his attempted murder, about the terror of not knowing who to trust, of feeling like she was going crazy, about finding the listening devices in their home and realizing that someone had been in their most private spaces, monitoring their lives. The defense attorney tried to make it seem like Vanessa had orchestrated everything, had planted evidence to make Amanda look guilty. But Vanessa's testimony was too consistent, too detailed. And her alibi for the morning I'd seen the suitcase thrown in the lake was ironclad. Time cards, security footage from the dental office showing her arriving at 5:30 in the morning, witness testimony from co-workers. I testified too. About what I'd seen that dawn morning. about pulling the suitcase from the lake, about the fear I'd felt when I realized what it meant. The defense attorney tried to suggest I'd been confused, that maybe I'd seen Vanessa and just forgotten, but I held firm. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it hadn't been Vanessa. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts, attempted murder, stalking, fraud, forgery. The judge sentenced her to 25 years. I sat in that courtroom and watched as they led her away in handcuffs. She turned at the door to look back at Daniel one last time, and even then, even in that moment, she smiled at him, like they shared some secret, like this was just a temporary setback and someday, somehow, she'd still get what she wanted. It made my blood run cold. Daniel made a full recovery. It took months of treatment to repair the damage to his kidneys and liver, but the doctors said he'd been incredibly lucky. Another few weeks and the damage might have been irreversible. As it is, he'll need to have his kidney function monitored for the rest of his life. We'll need to be careful about certain medications that could stress his already damaged organs. But he's alive. He's healthy. He has a future. He and Vanessa moved away from Cedar Lake after the trial, said they needed a fresh start somewhere without those memories. I understood. Some places hold too much pain, too many ghosts. They packed up their house, sold it to a young couple from out of state who knew nothing about what had happened there. I helped them move, sorted through their belongings, threw away anything that reminded them of that terrible time. They found a house in Portland, a small craftsman-style place with a big backyard and neighbors who welcomed them warmly. Daniel got a job with a tech company there, something with better hours and less stress. Vanessa went back to dental hygiene, found a practice that appreciated her skills and her dedication. They're expecting their first child in 3 months. A girl. They're going to name her Dawn, which made me cry when Daniel told me. When I asked him why that name, he said it was because dawn is when the darkness ends, when the light comes back. It's when I saw what I saw and decided to act. It's when their lives were saved. A new beginning, born from that terrible morning when I saw something that didn't make sense and refused to let it go. I visited them in Portland last month. Their house is bright and cheerful, filled with plants and light, and the kind of joy that comes from surviving something terrible together. I watched Daniel paint the nursery, a soft yellow with white trim, and I thought about how close we'd come to never having this moment, this ordinary, beautiful moment of a father preparing for his child. Vanessa made dinner, and we sat around their small dining table talking about baby names and nursery decorations and all the normal things that families talk about. At one point, Daniel reached across the table and took both our hands, mine and Vanessa's, and he said something I'll never forget. Daniel said, "I have 2 mothers now, one who gave me life and one who helped save it. I'm the luckiest man in the world." Vanessa and I looked at each other across that table, and I saw in her eyes what I felt in my heart. We'd been through hell together. We'd faced down a monster and won. We'd protected the person we both loved most. That kind of bond doesn't break. I still live in my house by the lake. I considered moving, considered following Daniel and Vanessa to Portland, or maybe going to Chicago to be closer to Thomas. But in the end, I stayed. This is my home. I've lived here for 37 years, raised my children here, loved my husband here, survived the worst days of my life here. I'm not going to let what happened drive me away. I still get up at 5 in the morning and stand at my kitchen window with my coffee, watching the mist roll across the water. But now I pay attention to everything I see, every detail, every person. Because I learned that terrible truth that day. Sometimes the worst monsters are the ones we never see coming. The ones who smile and plan and wait with infinite patience. The ones who love so obsessively that they can't tell the difference between love and destruction. I look at that lake every morning, and I remember what I pulled from its depths. Not just a suitcase full of documents, but the truth about someone's hidden nature. Sometimes I wonder what else is hidden beneath those calm waters, what other secrets people have tried to drown. But mostly I'm just grateful. Grateful I happened to be awake. Grateful I trusted my instincts. Grateful I had the courage to drag that suitcase from the bottom of the lake, even though I was terrified of what I might find. Because if I hadn't, my son would be dead, and an innocent woman would be in prison. And somewhere out there, Amanda would probably be planning her next obsession, her next victim. The community rallied around us after the truth came out. Neighbors I'd known for years stopped by with casseroles and kind words. The local paper ran an article about the case, about how vigilance and courage had saved lives. People I barely knew told me I was a hero, but I never felt like one. I just felt like a mother who'd seen something wrong and couldn't look away. The house that Daniel and Vanessa lived in was sold, as I mentioned, but I still walk past it sometimes on my evening walks. It looks different now with the new owners. They've painted it a different color, planted new flowers in the garden. They have no idea what happened inside those walls, what terror and obsession played out in those rooms. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe every place deserves a chance to start over, to be something new and better. I think about Amanda sometimes, locked away in prison. I wonder if she still believes that she and Daniel were meant to be together. I wonder if she understands what she did, or if in her mind, she's still the victim of some cosmic injustice. The prison psychiatrist who evaluated her said she showed no remorse, no understanding that her actions were wrong. She genuinely believed she was fighting for true love, that Vanessa was the villain in her story. It's chilling to think about how someone can be so disconnected from reality, so consumed by their own narrative, that they can justify attempted murder as an act of love. How they can watch someone suffer and call it devotion. I've learned things about myself through all of this. I learned that I'm braver than I thought I was, that I'm capable of action when it matters most, that my instincts, honed by years of motherhood, are worth trusting. I learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about the people you choose to fight for, the people you refuse to give up on no matter what. I learned that courage doesn't mean not being afraid. It means being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. It means standing at the edge of a dock with a ridiculous homemade fishing rig, trying to pull up something that might change everything, even though your hands are shaking and your heart is pounding and every instinct is telling you to walk away. Robert would have been proud of me, I think. My firefighter husband who always ran toward danger. He'd have understood why I couldn't just call the police, why I had to know for myself what was in that suitcase. He'd have done the same thing. I miss him every day, but especially on mornings like this. Mornings when the lake is calm and the world is quiet, and I'm standing here with my coffee, watching the new day begin. I wish I could tell him about everything that happened, hear his thoughts on it all. But in a way, I carry him with me. His voice in my head telling me to act first, think later. His belief that doing the right thing is always worth the risk. The lake is peaceful this morning. The heron is back, picking its way through the shallows like it does every day. The sun is rising, painting the mist gold and pink. It's beautiful, the kind of morning that makes you grateful to be alive. And I am grateful. Despite everything, or maybe because of everything, I'm grateful for each new day. Grateful for my sons, for my daughter-in-law, for the granddaughter who'll be born soon. Grateful that sometimes, when you refuse to look away from something wrong, you can actually make a difference. I finish my coffee and set the mug down. Time to start the day. Time to live the life I fought so hard to protect. The life we all fought so hard to save. Because in the end, that's what matters. Not the darkness we've seen, but the light we choose to live in afterward. The lake keeps its secrets, but I keep mine too now. The memory of that morning, of everything that followed, is something I'll carry forever. Not as a burden, but as a reminder. A reminder to pay attention, to trust my instincts, to never assume I know the whole story just by looking at the surface. Because beneath every calm surface, there's always something deeper. And sometimes what's hidden below can either destroy you or save you. I chose to dive deep, to pull up the truth, even though it terrified me. And that choice made all the difference.